never thought my marriage would end in a lawyer's office, much less with a briefcase full of cash changing hands in a high-rise suite overlooking downtown Manhattan. But then again, I never expected to marry into a dynasty like the Prescotts, a family so deeply entrenched in power and wealth that their name opened doors even in cities they'd never set foot in. Daniel and I had met like many modern couples, through mutual connections and corporate events. I was a marketing strategist working for a boutique agency. He was the heir apparent to Prescott Financial Holdings. We had a whirlwind romance. Private jets, Aspen weekends, French wine tastings. I'd never lived that way before, and at first, I thought it was love. But I quickly learned there was a sharp difference between affection and acquisition, and Daniel was a collector more than a companion. Still, I believed marriage would soften him. That belief was my first mistake. By our 4th anniversary, Daniel had grown cold and detached. Our conversations were transactional. Our intimacy faded. His family, especially his father Richard, treated me like a tolerated outsider, a woman whose presence was necessary for image but burdensome for legacy. I wasn't blue-blooded. I didn't attend Princeton. I hadn't been presented at any debutante balls. I was a girl from Michigan whose father fixed car engines and whose mother worked double shifts at a local diner. In the Prescott household, that made me a liability. And then, on a gray Thursday in October, Richard asked to meet. He didn't do small talk, and he certainly didn't make requests lightly. So when I received the email from his secretary asking me to join him for lunch at the Prescott Towers executive dining floor, I knew something was coming. Still, nothing could have prepared me for what he actually said. The dining room was silent when I arrived, just one long mahogany table set with silverware I knew I wasn't supposed to touch yet. Richard was already seated at the head, a crystal glass of water in front of him, his expression as unreadable as stone. "Isabel," he said, standing with exaggerated politeness. "Thank you for making the time." I sat across from him. The waiter brought a salad I didn't order and a menu I wouldn't use. Richard waited until the server stepped out. "I'll be direct," he said, clasping his hands on the table. "This marriage has run its course. I believe you know that. And frankly, it's become inconvenient." I held his gaze, refusing to blink. "If this is your way of asking me to encourage your son to file for divorce, Richard, maybe you should speak to him instead." He smiled slightly, but it didn't touch his eyes. "Daniel doesn't always make smart decisions. He's emotionally immature. You've seen that. But I have to protect the firm and the name. Scandals are bad for business." "And what scandal is there?" I asked, biting down on the insult that was forming in my throat. "A quiet divorce between two adults? That's hardly newsworthy." Richard leaned back and pulled out a sleek, silver envelope from his briefcase. He slid it across the table. Inside was a cashier's check, $5 million. "Take the money, Isabel. File for divorce. Walk away. I don't care where you go. Just disappear from our narrative. No media interviews, no memoirs, no lawyers dragging our name through court. You leave quietly, and you'll be compensated for your discretion." I looked at the check. My heart thudded hard. Not from temptation, but from fury. "You think I'm some kind of gold digger, don't you?" I said, almost laughing. "I think you're pragmatic," he replied coolly. "You've always struck me as someone who understands opportunity." I paused, steadying my breath. I knew better than to react emotionally in a room like this. But something else clicked in me then, an instinct I hadn't relied on in years. I remember my father's advice when I was a teenager working weekends at his garage. Never show your hand when someone's bluffing. Let them think they've won. Then figure out what they're trying to hide. So I smiled. "And if I say no?" His jaw tightened slightly. "Then we'll make things difficult. For you. Quietly, of course. No bank will hire you again. Your professional reputation won't survive a whisper campaign. Our reach is long, Isabel." He wasn't threatening me with violence. It was worse than that. He was threatening my future. And the terrifying thing was, I believed him. I stood up, palms slick with sweat, and picked up the envelope. "I'll consider it," I said, tucking it into my handbag. "Good girl," Richard murmured. I walked out of that room with shaking hands, the kind of anger that tastes metallic sitting on my tongue. But I didn't go home to cry or rant. I went straight to a coworker of mine, Gina, who'd left the agency to become a cybersecurity consultant. We'd stayed friends. She was sharp and discreet. I handed her my phone. "Tell me this app is still installed," I said. She smirked. "Voice recorder? Of course. You've used it for brainstorming meetings for years." I exhaled. "Good. Because I just caught a billionaire offering hush money to erase me from his family." She stared at me, then nodded. "Tama plays smart." We backed up the recording, time-stamped everything, and I encrypted it with a password only she and I knew. Then I called a lawyer. Not just any lawyer, but a divorce specialist known for handling high-profile breakups with surgical precision. The next morning, I filed for divorce. And the day after that, I began following the money. Not to spend it, but to trace it. Because something told me Richard Prescott wasn't stupid enough to hand over $5 million of his own savings. And if I could prove that the money came from somewhere it shouldn't have, I wouldn't just be leaving the marriage. I'd be exposing a legacy. The morning after I filed for divorce, the weight of what I had just done sank into my bones. I sat on the edge of the bed in the penthouse Daniel and I had shared, my suitcase still half-zipped on the floor. The silence in the apartment was unfamiliar, too quiet without Daniel's passive-aggressive clatter or the echo of his late-night calls that he never explained. But I wasn't grieving anymore. I was calculating. I hadn't spent a cent of the $5 million Richard gave me. It wasn't temptation I felt. It was suspicion. I didn't believe for a second that he'd simply written a personal check from his private fortune. He was too controlling, too careful. And that silver envelope, there was something staged about it. My instincts told me there was a deeper story behind where that money came from, and I needed to uncover it before anyone else tried to rewrite it. Gina, thankfully, was already 2 steps ahead. By the time I arrived at her office that morning, she'd pulled up metadata from the audio file, documented the original timestamp, and created a backup chain so solid that even the most aggressive corporate attorneys would have trouble challenging its authenticity. She sat at her desk, tapping a pen against her lips as I entered. "I've been thinking," she said without preamble. "Richard Smart. A guy like that doesn't put his name directly on anything dirty. So I started tracing the transaction you showed me, the deposit that hit your account." I dropped my bag beside her chair and leaned over the screen. She pulled up the wire record. The sender was something called Argent Vista Holdings, with a registered address in the British Virgin Islands. A shell company, no doubt. "That's not his personal account," I said flatly. "Of course not. This is a classic laundering mechanism," she said, pulling up a flowchart she'd built overnight. I traced Argent Vista Holdings back through a web of dummy corporations. Most of them barely have websites, let alone real offices. But here's the interesting part. Look at this name. She pointed at the screen. Montlake Capital Management. My heart dropped. That was one of the Prescott firm's subsidiary funds. I remembered hearing Daniel mention it once at a gala, dismissively bragging about diverting capital into tax-friendlier verticals. "You're saying this isn't just shady, it's connected directly to their actual business?" I asked. "Bingo. This holding company was created to move funds from Montlake through offshore accounts. And then it sent that $5 million to you. It wasn't Richard's personal bribe. It was stolen money, very likely from their clients." A chill ran through me. If that were true, then Richard wasn't just buying my silence. He was using embezzled or laundered funds to do it. That moved this from unethical to criminal. We spent the next 4 hours documenting everything. Gina cross-referenced board filings, identified 2 former accountants who had blown the whistle on Prescott financial years ago, only to be buried in legal threats. We found an obscure SEC document suggesting the firm had been under quiet review, nothing public but something brewing. She even managed to find a former assistant CFO from Montlake who now worked in Chicago. His LinkedIn profile hinted that he left finance due to ethical concerns. I made a note to contact him later, carefully. By the time I left her office, my mind was racing. If this blew open, Richard could go down. Maybe even Daniel. The name Prescott was engraved on buildings, on scholarships, on museum wings. But behind it was rot, and I was holding a thread that could unravel it all. I went home and locked everything, recordings, documents, screenshots, into 2 encrypted USB drives. One I kept in a safe deposit box. The other I handed to Gina to store in a vault she had access to through her firm. If anything happened to me, I wanted someone else to have a full copy. Still, I couldn't just wait for the divorce hearing to reveal it all. I needed corroboration. The next week, I met with a financial crimes attorney recommended by my divorce lawyer. His name was Matthew Rains, and he had the cool, analytical look of someone who spent his life thinking in clauses and criminal codes. He listened quietly as I laid everything out, showing him the files, the wire transfers, and the corporate documents Gina had traced. When I finished, he folded his hands. If this is true, and if it can be proven in court, you're sitting on explosive evidence. But you need to be extremely careful. Because it's powerful, because it's dangerous, he said bluntly. These people don't fight with fists, Isabel. They use courts, media, and silence. And you've just proven you're not staying quiet. He agreed to represent me on the federal side and advised me not to go to the SEC just yet. Not until you make your case in court and protect your position. Let them show their hand first. He also suggested I start documenting everything, including any contact with Richard or Daniel, emails, texts, even seemingly harmless messages. 2 days later, I got my first one. Daniel had found out about the check. He didn't know I knew, but I could tell from the tone of his text. Hope you're enjoying your little windfall. Don't pretend like you didn't marry for the money. I stared at my screen, feeling the urge to respond. But I didn't. Instead, I screenshot it, forwarded it to Matthew, and added it to my growing file. What struck me most was the bitterness. He hadn't asked why I filed. He hadn't called. He hadn't tried to fix anything. That message wasn't heartbreak. It was ownership slipping through his fingers. For a moment, I wondered if he knew where the money came from. Maybe he thought his father had written the check from personal account. Or maybe he didn't care. In either case, I was done giving him the benefit of the doubt. The following week, I booked a flight to Chicago to speak to the former assistant CFO, Alex Delano. He agreed to meet on the condition of anonymity. We sat in a coffee shop downtown, surrounded by the noise of commuters and espresso machines. He looked older than his photo, eyes tired, fingers restless. I can't go on the record, he said immediately, but I'll tell you this. There were accounts we weren't allowed to audit, controlled directly by Richard and one other exec, Gerard McNeil. Every time we asked questions, we were reassigned or ignored. Did you see transactions connected to Argent Vista Holdings? He froze for a second, then gave a slow, incredulous nod. That name haunted me. It came up right before I left. There were deposits into it that never showed up in the ledger, and withdrawals that looked like legal settlements, but no case records. I showed him the wire to my account. His lips pressed into a thin line. They're laundering client money, he said finally, using shell companies to distribute personal payouts. I was 90% sure before. Now I'm 100%. That was the confirmation I needed. When I returned to New York, I had everything documented, cross-referenced, and validated by both my cybersecurity team and Matthew. We built a timeline of transactions. We labeled every shell company. We listed the pattern of payouts. And then we prepared the binder. A 200-page file, organized, time-stamped, and sealed. I wasn't just preparing for a divorce anymore. I was preparing for war. And I knew exactly where I'd strike first, the courtroom. When the judge asked if I had anything else to add before the final ruling, I would raise my hand and pull the curtain back on the empire that tried to erase me with a bribe. The day of the final divorce hearing began without drama. No thunderclouds, no grand symbolic winds, just a clear, indifferent sky over Manhattan and the sound of tires on wet pavement as my car pulled up to the courthouse. I remember staring out the window, watching pedestrians rush past with coffee in one hand and phones in the other, their lives untouched by the storm I was about to unleash. Inside the courthouse, the walls smelled faintly of dust and paper, and everything echoed a little more than it should. I walked past familiar court clerks and elevators I'd taken during preliminary meetings. But today wasn't like the others. Today was the conclusion, or so everyone thought. Daniel arrived with his lawyer, Patrick Morell, a silver-haired, smug corporate attorney who specialized in making settlements go away quietly. Daniel wore a tailored navy suit, his usual arrogance in full bloom. He didn't look at me when he walked in, didn't nod, didn't even flinch. Just sat down with his phone and started scrolling like this was a minor inconvenience between brunch reservations. Across from them, my attorney, Claudia Morris, gave me a small nod. She was sharp, composed, and exactly the kind of woman Richard Prescott hated, because she didn't flinch, didn't flatter, and certainly didn't forget. She placed our prepared binder on the table and whispered, "Last chance to change your mind." I shook my head. "No, it ends today." When the judge entered, Honorable Mary Rutledge, everyone stood, the usual procession of protocol. She was known for being no-nonsense, with a reputation for fairness and razor-sharp memory. She got straight to it. "We're here to finalize the dissolution of marriage between Isabel Prescott and Daniel Prescott. Based on prior hearings, asset division has been agreed upon, spousal support waived by mutual agreement, and no children are involved." She glanced down at her file. "Are both parties prepared to finalize today?" Patrick stood. "Yes, Your Honor. My client is ready to proceed." Claudia rose beside me. "Your Honor, before we conclude, the petitioner would like to submit new evidence relevant to the case." There was a flicker of surprise on Judge Rutledge's face, but she nodded. "Proceed." Claudia handed the thick binder to the clerk, who walked it over to the bench. The judge opened it, flipping slowly through the opening pages. Daniel finally looked at me. "What is this?" he asked under his breath. I didn't answer. "Your Honor," Claudia said clearly, "inside this binder is audio and financial documentation related to an undisclosed monetary exchange between the respondent's father, Mr. Richard Prescott, and the petitioner. We believe this evidence has direct relevance to the divorce proceedings, the nature of the agreement reached, and the ethical obligations of all parties involved." Rutledge raised an eyebrow. "Undisclosed monetary exchange?" Claudia nodded. "A payment of $5 million made through a shell company connected to Prescott Financial Holdings, issued in an attempt to coerce my client into divorcing quietly and disappearing. My client not only recorded this conversation, but also traced the funds, revealing that the payment was not from personal wealth, but from corporate entities possibly tied to illegal activity." Daniel rose to his feet. "This is insane. She's making this up." "Mr. Prescott, sit down," the judge snapped, her voice icy. "You'll speak when asked." She pressed a button on her desk, and the courtroom speakers crackled to life. Claudia clicked play. Richard's voice filled the room, crisp and unmistakable. "Take the money, Isabel. File for divorce. Walk away. I don't care where you go. Just disappear from our narrative." The room fell utterly silent. You could hear the whir of the air vents. "Then we'll make things difficult. For you. Quietly, of course. No bank will hire you again." I kept my eyes on Daniel. He wasn't scrolling his phone anymore. His jaw clenched. He looked pale. When the clip ended, the judge leaned back slowly in her chair. "I see," she said after a long pause. "And these financial documents, they're verified?" Claudia handed over notarized statements from the forensic accountant. "Yes, Your Honor. All transfers are documented. The shell companies are registered offshore, but the originating funds are traceable to a Prescott financial subsidiary, Montlake Capital Management. The recipient account belongs to the petitioner. We have digital trails, timestamps, and corroborating expert testimony ready." Patrick tried to object. "This is beyond the scope of a divorce proceeding. If there are financial crimes involved." Judge Rutledge held up a hand. "Mr. Morell, if your client's father attempted to bribe the petitioner using laundered corporate funds, that is not just relevant. It's material. In fact, I'm now ethically obligated to refer this evidence to the appropriate authorities." Patrick went quiet. Daniel's mouth opened, then closed. He stared at me as if trying to recalculate every moment of our marriage through a new lens. But I wasn't there to answer his questions. I was there to finish what he and his family started. Judge Rutledge turned to me. "Miss Prescott, do you wish to proceed with the divorce today?" I nodded. "Yes, Your Honor. But I request that this financial evidence be formally entered into the record and that the court recommend federal review." She nodded. "It will be done. Divorce finalized. Evidence entered. And a formal notification will be sent to the U.S. Attorney's Office and the Securities and Exchange Commission." She signed the decree. The gavel came down. The courtroom didn't explode into chaos. No one screamed. No one ran. But the silence was louder than any outburst. I walked out with Claudia, heart pounding but legs steady. Outside the courthouse, the sun was shining again. The city moved on as if nothing had happened. But I knew better. Within the next 24 hours, the SEC would receive a binder with every document, every audio clip, every traceable transfer. And within 72 hours, Richard Prescott would receive a letter informing him he was under investigation. I hadn't just walked away with the truth. I'd walked away with the trigger that would shatter their empire. The morning after the hearing, I woke to 27 missed calls. 12 from Daniel, 4 from Patrick, and the rest from numbers I didn't recognize but instinctively knew belonged to press outlets, corporate PR firms, or junior assistants tasked with reaching out before this story gets legs. I turned off my phone, rolled over in bed, and stared at the ceiling, allowing a breath to finally fill my lungs without shaking. It was over, not in the fairy tale sense. There would be no parade, no applause, no sudden peace, but it was over in the way that mattered. The divorce was finalized. The truth was documented. And the monster behind the curtain had finally been dragged into the light. Now, the fire I'd started was going to burn with or without me. By noon, it had begun. The Wall Street Ledger ran a brief but loaded headline. Prescott Financial under federal review following internal document leak. No names, no photos, but enough precision in the wording to make it clear that someone inside the Prescott machine had blown the whistle. That someone, of course, was me. 2 hours later, a larger piece followed from the Times. $5 million divorce bribe triggers investigation into offshore fund misuse. That one named me. And Richard. And Montlake Capital. My photo was taken from an old LinkedIn post I hadn't updated in years. My inbox flooded. Journalists asked for statements. Friends I hadn't spoken to since college reached out with half-curious, half-horrified messages. But the most surprising came from the one person I never expected to hear from again, Daniel. He didn't call this time. He emailed. Subject: You destroyed everything. I didn't open it right away. When I finally did, his words were laced with the same cold entitlement that had defined our marriage. You had no right to drag our family through the mud. You could have walked away. You had the money. You got what you wanted. But you needed to make a show of it. Congratulations. My father's being investigated. Our board is panicking. Our name is ruined. And for what? Because you didn't get enough attention while we were married? I read it once. Then again. Then deleted it. There was nothing left to say to him. The real noise started 3 days later. The SEC issued a formal subpoena to Prescott Financial Holdings. A separate investigative unit within the U.S. Attorney's Office opened a white-collar crime probe. Richard Prescott hadn't made a public appearance since the story broke. No denials. No counter-narrative. Just silence, which in their world meant panic. A week after the hearing, I received a call from a restricted number. It was Agent Keller from the Financial Crimes Division. He'd reviewed the evidence. Wanted to meet. We sat in a glass-walled conference room inside a nondescript government building. He wore a gray suit and a neutral expression, and he listened carefully as I recounted everything again. How Richard made the offer, how I traced the money, how I preserved the evidence, and made sure it passed through the right legal channels. When I finished, he gave a small nod. You understand what you did, right? I exposed fraud, I said. He leaned forward. You built a prosecutable case. Not a theory, not an accusation, evidence. You did what 3 federal analysts haven't been able to do in 2 years. I exhaled. I hadn't realized how tightly I'd been holding my breath again. There's going to be more, he continued. This opens up not just Prescott Financial, but every partner fund, every client account tied to Montlake and beyond. This might be the biggest corporate fraud case since Madoff. I felt the floor shift slightly beneath that statement. Not because I hadn't imagined it, but because I had, and now it was real. Keller assured me that I would remain protected. He asked if I'd testify if needed. I agreed. I wasn't hiding anymore. And truthfully, I wasn't afraid anymore either. The following months unfolded like a domino chain. Richard was subpoenaed. He tried to claim the payment was a private settlement from family funds to protect his son's reputation, but the forensic trail ripped that lie to shreds. The offshore entities, the unauthorized withdrawals from client accounts, the ghost signatures, all of it lined up. Within 2 months, Richard was indicted on charges of conspiracy to commit wire fraud, money laundering, obstruction of justice, and securities violations. Daniel stepped down from his position on the Prescott board before the heat reached him. He issued a public statement about personal turmoil and taking time to rebuild. But the damage was already done. Clients pulled out. Investors fled. Prescott Financial's stock value cratered, and regulators froze multiple assets across the firm's portfolios. I watched it all unfold from a quiet apartment on the Lower East Side I'd rented under a different name, far from the penthouse world I had once occupied. I took long walks. I read again. I made soup from scratch. I worked freelance jobs, helped local nonprofits with digital strategy, and lived in a space that didn't echo with resentment. Occasionally, I'd run into someone who recognized me, from a headline, from social media, from some media commentary. Some asked if I regretted it, if I wished I had just taken the money and disappeared like Richard wanted. I always answered the same. I did take the money. I just didn't disappear. By the time Richard's trial date was confirmed, I'd been invited to speak at 2 financial ethics conferences, one at Columbia, one at Berkeley. I accepted both, but I asked them not to frame me as a victim. I wasn't victimized, I said. I was underestimated. There's a difference. Daniel never tried to contact me again after that email. I learned through mutual contacts that he moved to London to avoid the media frenzy. Rumor had it he was trying to start a hedge fund, but no serious investor would go near him anymore. The name Prescott had gone from status to scandal in less than 6 months. And me? I kept every promise I made to myself. I never cashed the check. Instead, I placed the full $5 million in escrow and, on my attorney's advice, surrendered it voluntarily to federal investigators as evidence. That decision alone, they said, likely saved me from becoming a collateral legal target. But more than that, it cleared my conscience. I hadn't blown the whistle for money. I hadn't exposed the Prescotts for revenge. I had done it because I knew what silence costs. I had watched too many people get swallowed by it. So I spoke, loudly. I left behind the world I'm married into, the world that tried to erase me. And in return, I built something new, not glamorous, not gilded, but honest. And that, in the end, was the richest thing I ever owned.